All right, welcome to Hacking the Smart Grid. We're going to get started a little bit earlier, but hopefully that means we can leave time for questions at the end. All right, so my name is Tony Flick. I'm a principal with Firm Associates. We're a information security services company. I've been in the information assurance field for a little bit over 6 years. I've been to Vegas many times. This is my first time presenting at Black Hat, so been to Vegas a couple times, sometimes more memorable than others, but this is my first time presenting. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of give a high-level overview of what the smart grid is. A lot of people know what it is, but some people might not, so we'll kind of give that 30-second overview of what it is, what components actually make up the smart grid, some of the problems that we've encountered with the smart grid. So I'll kind of cover some of the problems that have been uncovered, some of the potential problems that we see with it. On top of that, I'm going to go through the security initiatives. So our fearless leaders have kind of created some security initiatives to try to solve these problems that we've already identified. And I'm kind of going to go over what's in it, what's not in it, what are some of the problems with it. On top of that, I'm going to kind of go through a timeline. So one of the things that has been mentioned over and over again about security with the smart grid is integrating security from the beginning. And that's something that I agree with, but there's one component with regards to integrating security from the beginning that is important to have, but we're kind of lacking here. So I'll kind of cover that in a little bit of detail. On top of that, I want to kind of cover history repeating itself. So one of the things that we've noticed with the rollout of the smart grid is that we're making the same kind of mistakes that we have with past technological initiatives, and we're kind of making those same mistakes again. And so I just want to kind of point those out. And then at the end, go over some of the recommendations to help improve the security in the smart grid. And then hopefully if we have time, I'll answer a few questions. All right, so what is a smart grid? So let's look at what we've got for say like the last 50 years. So we have this electrical infrastructure. Some people have coined it as the analog infrastructure. And so basically you have a meter at your house, at your business, and about once every couple of months, the electric company sends someone out to actually read that meter in order to give you an accurate bill. Then we kind of step forward. If we go into the intermediate process, there's something called the AMR, which is advanced meter reading. So basically, it's kind of like that one-way communication so that utility companies can actually remotely read your meter. So they don't actually have to send someone out there to read the device once every couple months. What we're going towards, however, is this kind of digital infrastructure. So we've got two-way communication capabilities, and on top of that, basically everything's going to be connected. So for example, you're going to have your smart meters in there. You're going to have your interfaces. So say, for example, on your wall, you're going to have this digital interface that's going to allow you to look at how much energy you're using per hour. It's going to be basically quasi-real time. On top of that, even devices like your refrigerator, your air conditioner, your heater, your dishwasher, all these things are going to be connected to the smart grid. And so basically the issue with that is now that we're connecting all these devices, what kind of problems are going to occur? All right, so network infrastructure. So in order to do this, we have to come up with some kind of network infrastructure to connect all these devices. And basically what's going to happen is we're going to connect the electrical infrastructure with the current internet. So what's going to happen is all these devices are going to be able to speak to each other, and which is going to allow this bidirectional communication, which is going to introduce a number of new flaws. All right, so what are the actual problems? So the easiest one to talk about is physical security. So we're going to be rolling out these smart meters into everyone's homes and businesses. So everyone's going to have access to the smart meter. So how do you actually protect people from actually tampering with it? So if we look in the past, how have the companies currently done it? So for example, General Electric actually has a patent out on how to prevent electricity theft. And it kind of relies on firmware as opposed to hardware. So it's saying that firmware is tougher to tamper with because it doesn't have mechanical parts. Now, I think everyone in this room would agree that firmware is actually pretty easy to tamper with. So it kind of goes into this whole history repeating itself is, are we going to make the same problems that we have in the past? And so one of the other issues is that these electricity companies are creating websites. So for example, if you want to check your energy usage, you can go on to their websites and check that quasi real-time issue. quasi real-time energy usage. And on top of that, there are some additional functionalities. So for example, say you go on vacation for a month and you want to turn off your electricity. Well, all you have to do is log into this website and turn off your electricity. So the problems that occur is we're going to face the exact same problems that we have in the past as we are in the future. So every problem that is occurring at the network level, every problem that's occurring at the application layer, you're still going to see that in this smart grid. So let's look at the implications. So privacy concerns. So some people may be concerned that, say, their neighbors are able to actually see their power usage. So one of the issues is, are you concerned that your neighbor can see that you use more power than them? Maybe, maybe not. But what if you take into case, maybe, for example, you have a grow operation. You might not want everybody to know that you're growing something illegal in your house. If your neighbor starts smelling something funny, they notice that your electrical usage is about 3 times as much as theirs, they might be able to find that out. On top of that, electric companies can actually remotely disconnect you. So if you say you got laid off, you're missing a few payments, well, they're going to remotely disconnect you, and your neighbor's going to find that out. So, and that could be a little bit embarrassing, but there are a few privacy concerns with this. But what the major concerns is what we're kind of getting up to, and that's the denial of service. So, can someone actually turn off your electricity? And what I'm kind of going to go through in this presentation a little bit later on is how exactly they're going to disable your electricity. And on top of that, some prankster out there is going to find a way to mess with Google Maps to do some kind of art. They're going to tell their girlfriend, "I love you," and they're going to spell it like across the U.S. or across the state of Florida, something along those lines. So that's kind of like the consumer perspective. But let's look at the actual energy company. One of the major concerns is electricity theft. They want that revenue. Now, the first thing that I thought of when I was looking into this, well, what about the office space problem? So you start kind of subtracting a few watts here, a few watts there. Maybe the electricity company doesn't notice it, but over time, you're able to save a lot of money, but the electricity company is going to be losing a lot of money. So there's some implications there. All right, so let's actually look at the security initiatives. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. So this was an act passed by Congress back in 2007, and what it did was it actually gave it tasked the Department of Energy with monitoring the smart grid rollout. And on top of that, it kind of tasked NIST, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, with creating this interoperability framework. And what the framework does is it ensures that all types of devices can actually connect to the smart grid, because basically what they don't want to happen is just having these like 1 or 2 devices that are locked down that have to be rolled out. But on top of that, and more importantly for this conversation, is that it does include several security documents. And the ones I'm going to be talking about today is the Advanced Metering Infrastructure System Security Requirements, AMI, and this basically handles all the security controls that are geared toward the smart meters that are actually going to be deployed. But on top of that, we're going to talk, it also includes the NERC CIP documents, and basically these are security controls that are meant for basically the entire grid. And if you're curious, NERC stands for the North American Energy Reliability Corporation. All right, now what are the problems with these? So basically in these documents, they're very high level. They basically state, we want to integrate security from the beginning. Great. We want confidentiality, we want integrity, we want availability. How are you actually going to implement that? Well, according to this AMI security document, it's basically to be determined by the organization. So one of the things we're getting at is that we're saying the right stuff, but how do you actually implement that? And the problem is it's a little bit vague on how you actually do that, because what they're doing is they're kind of leaving it up to the technology companies and the utility companies to make the decisions on how to actually implement these standards. So this might be a little bit difficult for you to read. So just to give you an example of how it's kind of vague and how it kind of leaves it up to the organization to actually determine what type of security to implement, I'm just going to kind of read the first one. So the security function shall enforce a limit of organization-defined number consecutive invalid access attempts by a user during a organization-defined time period. the security function shall automatically lock the account node for an organization-defined time period. Delays next login prompt according to organization-defined delay algorithm. So going back to the first statement, security function shall enforce a limit of organization-defined consecutive invalid access attempts. So we're letting the companies decide how many invalid login attempts. Why not actually put in there the industry regarded best practice? Why not state after 3 or 5 attempts, let's lock them out? But in this case, we're leaving it up to the organization. So what some of the kind of like the background that I'm going to be talking about is the whole concept of compliance versus security. That's kind of like a big topic right now in the industry as a whole. And if you're compliant, does that mean that you're secure? Not necessarily. So if we take this first statement as an example, you know, who's to say the company makes a requirement that maybe it's 3 invalid access attempts, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 100,000. If they define it as 100,000, if they're compliant, maybe they are compliant, but are they secure? And my argument would be that no, they're not actually secure. So these are basically just 3 examples of what I found. If you go read through the document, it's about 111 pages long, but you'll find numerous examples of this type of statements. All right, so kind of going back to the whole argument of integrating security from the beginning. So I'm kind of go over when each of these initiatives have come into play. So we already talked about the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, but then this NIST Smart Grid Interoperability Framework that came out in this year, basically in May. On top of that, we've got the AMI, which we've kind of already talked about, and that was developed 2007 to 2008. The NERC CIP documents, 2006, it was updated in 2009. And then on top of that, there are a number of bills in practice that are in Congress right now. They're not law yet, they're kind of being discussed. And so not sure if they're actually going to become law or not, but it's something that's kind of on the horizon. So what is the problem with this? So we've actually already been rolling out smart grids. So in order to integrate security from the beginning, you actually have to do it from the actual beginning. You can't do it 5 years later. So just to kind of give you an example, the city of Austin, they started designing their smart grid in 2002, and then they actually started rolling out devices in 2003. So that's obviously a few years before 2007, 2006, 2009. And I'm just using Austin and Salt River Project as examples, but smart grids have been rolling out for a while now. All right, so let's kind of look at how history is repeating itself. So I'm going to use PCI DSS as an example. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the payment card industry data security standard. And basically this kind of ensures that merchants, banks, they maintain a certain security level. And one of the major criticisms of this is that it's an example of self-policing. So the industry is policing itself. So the ones who are responsible for ensuring that these merchants, these banks actually adhere to these security requirements are the credit card companies. So MasterCard, Visa, for example. So that's kind of an example of how that industry self-polices itself. On top of that, there's something called an SAQ. It stands for a self-assessment questionnaire. So depending on the number of transactions you do, one of the requirements is that you fill out a self-assessment questionnaire. And it's basically, are you compliant with this security standard? Yes, I am. Are you compliant with this security standard? Yes, I am. And then you kind of hand it over and say, yes, I am compliant. So let's look at how that comes into play in the electric industry. So we do have these 2 organizations, NERC and FERC. I already talked about NERC, but FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so NERC kind of put out those documents, the CIP documents, and within those are kind of very high level standards. And inside those, basically it says that these organizations must self-certify. And what's happened is when we actually went back and looked into it, they found that these companies were underreporting their critical assets. So they weren't actually reporting on all of their components that make up the smart grid. They were just reporting on the ones that kind of looked good. And is this going to matter? You know, of course it is. And it kind of goes back to, well, how have they done in the past? So let's talk about the Aurora vulnerability. Some of you may remember this, some of you may not. Basically, it was a vulnerability that was identified in power systems, and it happened a few years ago. But basically what they found was a Department of Homeland Security committee found that 2 to 3 years after a remediation plan had been given to these utility companies, they still hadn't remediated it. So several years after the remediation plan was given to them, they still haven't remediated it. So let's look at the other proven track record. So I did some research before this presentation, and I actually went to the utility company websites. So when you look, what I'm talking about here are those websites that are set up for users to go in and track their energy usage online. On top of that, if you remember the vacation scenario. So if someone wants to go online and disable their electricity for a couple of weeks, they can do that through these websites. And this kind of represents the convergence of the electrical infrastructure and our current networking infrastructure. And so what I found on these websites were very simple, very basic security vulnerabilities. So user authentication going over clear text protocols, cross-site scripting, information leakage. Basically, if you go run through the OWASP top 10, you're going to find examples of each of those vulnerabilities in these websites. So when we're talking about how do you actually hack into the smart grid? Well, in order to do that, you can use the existing techniques. You can just go onto their website, the ones that they've set up, in order for you to gain access, and just use that to actually hack into the smart grid. One of the more amusing things that I kind of came across was that I came across a website where you could actually disable your electricity for a certain period of time, and I clicked on the login link, and it took me to a temporary page where it said, we apologize for any inconvenience, but over the past couple months, we've been migrating to a secure server. So, and it said, in about 5 seconds, you'll be redirected to this new secure server. So I got redirected, I waited, I was kind of curious, and it took me to a website that did clear text authentication. But in the URL, the new URL had the word secure in it. So obviously it was a very secure website. On top of that, who are some of the major partners that are coming out with monitoring your electrical usage? Google and Microsoft, right? So Google has their power meter, which is going to integrate with iGoogle. And then you have Microsoft, who's got their home website. And basically, in order to sign up for these services, you're using your Live ID or you're using your Google ID. So if you're familiar with, for example, Google services, by default, when you log in with your username and password, it sends it over encrypted. But the session IDs, by default, get sent over an unencrypted channel. So basically what I'm trying to imply here is that any vulnerabilities that exist in Microsoft Live and Google are going to carry over to the smart grid, these websites. All right, so what should we do? So we kind of missed the opportunity at the beginning to integrate security from the very beginning, but we can still do something. In my opinion, we should allow the security to mature. So why don't let us figure out the security problem, figure out solutions before we completely roll out the smart grid. So one of the things right now is that there's about $4.5 billion in stimulus money available for companies to grab in order to actually roll out these smart grids. So what's kind of happening is these companies obviously really want that cash. So let's get these products out into market as soon as possible. And when you rush things, obviously you're bound to make mistakes. On top of that, let's call for more stringent security requirements. So I kind of already touched on it before, the argument versus compliance versus secure. Why not make modifications to actually specify, after 3 invalid login attempts, the user becomes logged out for 30 minutes until the user calls in to an administrator and unlocks the account. On top of that, tighter regulation. So I know the immediate counter argument to this presentation is if you have too much regulation, too much security, you're going to stifle innovation. But if you go back to the CIA triad, what's one of the components? Availability. And if you don't have enough security, is it going to be available? No, it's not. So basically what I'm calling for is that tighter regulation to make sure that you are actually the kind of like the level between being compliant and being secure is more equal, kind of more on the same playing field. Any questions? Well, in my opinion, it's going to increase the basically how easy it is to get into the old. Because if you look at it this way. So you've got these websites set up, and they're going to be susceptible to the same old traditional vulnerabilities. So what's to stop you from logging in, breaking some credentials, getting in that way, accessing, and then using that as kind of like a jumping point to get into that older infrastructure. So if the proper segregation is not set up, then you can use those websites, those web servers, as kind of a jumping point into, say, the operations network. Yeah.
Who owns the data?
I apologize.
In these documents that you've given all these, who owns the user's data?
Who owns the user's data? The electrical companies. So that's a very good question, because the electric companies, they don't? Oh, so there's state rules?
And most of what you said here is so sorry for being factual. The TARP fund application, which is 40 pages, which I personally participated in filling out, has 20% that is set for cybersecurity, right? 20% of it. So getting stuff into market fast is not going to get you the money. You've got to prove to the federal government that you've dealt with cybersecurity. Websites are going to use far more security. And I don't know what company you look at, but I can guarantee you my company is not allowing you to turn off your whole house. Only items in your house, and not your refrigerator.
Different companies are doing different implementations.
So each state has a PUC, Public Utility Commission, that's highly regulated below the other things. So, Jonathan, you got to speak to that. I'm not jealous that I'm not speaking back. That's just what I'm saying is our POE. This is part of this. You need to read more research, maybe 2 years of research. This is so high level and so far back to listen.
Everyone's welcome to their opinion.
Did you answer, can I just get that? Who owns?
It's different in every state. In our state, it's the customer. In the state of Texas, it's the customer of the data. So the utility company has to go to great lengths to make sure that data is not given to somebody who the customer hasn't agreed to.
But in other states,
In other states, it can
it
be.
just varies. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at different.
It depends on whether you're looking at a regulated state or a deregulated state. So Texas is fully deregulated. It's a total different market than, say, California.
No, California's completely regulated as well.
I worked for EV for 10 years.
I work in Southern California, this is my thought. What?
You can choose the retail energy provider.
You used to, they are reintroducing that for commercial. Residential, no. But as far as who owns the data?
I was there during the failed social experiment, so I know.
Yeah, thanks to Texas Headline.
The point being is, it's different where you have multiple choices to choose who you buy your power from.
But even then, we still have to guard our customers' data.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, guys, I apologize. We can continue this conversation afterwards, but my time's up, so kind of have to make room for the next speaker.